My friends, viewers, prepare your hearts. What you are about to discover today will shatter the image we have of the Holy Land. The biting wind sweeps across the mountains of Judah as the temperature plummets. Jerusalem is at an altitude of 800 meters, 2,600 ft, and winter here. Oh my dears, it's no joke. Occasional snow, ice in the early mornings, temperatures near zero, 32 degrees, addressing the audience. A modern adult, without central heating, without thermal clothing, without proper insulation. How long would they survive? But 3,000 years ago, entire families didn't just survive these winters. They thrived. They raised children. They worked. They lived without electricity, without piped gas, without anything we consider essential today. How is this possible? Everyone imagines the Hebrews in the desert, light tunics, scorching sun, oases on the horizon. But that image, my dears, is incomplete. Most Israelites lived in the mountains. Jerusalem, Hebron, Shechem, Bethel, all at high altitudes and all faced winters that could kill. Jerusalem is 800 meters above sea level. Hebron, 930 meters, 3,050 ft. Shechem, 550 meters, 1,800 ft. For every 1,000 meters of altitude, the temperature drops over 6 degrees, about 3.5 degrees per $1,000 ft. Do the math. Today, Jerusalem has below freezing temperatures several nights a year. Snow falls every few winters. But 3,000 years ago, the climate was even more severe. Longer, colder, wetter winters. And the cold didn't come alone. Winds descended from the north like blades, accelerated through the valleys, and hit the exposed mountain cities with full force. And the rains, from November to March, turned everything into freezing mud. So how did these families survive months like this without modern technology? The answer, my friends, begins with something that seems wrong, the first great revelation. Before building up, they dug down. When you excavate a house in Tel Beersheba today, you find something curious. The floor of the ancient house is 60, sometimes 90 centimeters, 2-3 ft below the original ground level. They didn't build directly on the surface. First, they dug deep. Why? Because down there the temperature is more stable. In winter, the deep earth is warmer than the icy air. In summer, it's cooler than the scorching heat. Natural thermal insulation at no cost. But digging was just the beginning. The walls of these houses weren't just stacked stones. They were calculated heat retention systems. 60 centimeters, 2 ft thick. Sometimes 80 centimeters, 6 ft. Sometimes over 1 meter, 3.3 ft. Think about it. A modern concrete wall is 15 to 20 centimeters, 6 to 8 in. These ancient walls were 4 times thicker, and it wasn't solid stone. There was a specific technique, 2 rows of large stones on the outside and between them. Smaller stones and compacted earth. This intermediate space created an air pocket, and trapped air acts as insulation. It stops the heat from escaping. But there was more. The stone used was limestone, that light, porous stone from the mountains of Judah. And this stone, my dears, has an incredible property. It absorbs heat during the day slowly as if it was storing it. At night, it releases that heat gradually. It's a natural thermal battery. You'd light the fire during the day. The walls would heat up, and they would continue to radiate heat for hours after the fire went out. The roofs followed the same logic. Wooden beams on top of them, interwoven branches, and on top of that, clay mixed with straw. Layers 30 centimeters, 1 ft thick. This dense roof held in the heat that rose and blocked the cold that descended. The windows? Tiny, 40 centimeters, 16 in, at most. The smaller the opening, the less heat escapes. And the doors? They were low. You had to duck your head to enter. It wasn't cultural humility, my friends, it was physics. Hot air rises, cold air sinks. A low door minimizes air exchange. Inside, plaster and lime render, a smooth surface that sealed every crack where the wind would try to enter. The result? The internal temperature was 15 to 20 degrees C, higher than outside. But these thick walls needed a constant source of heat. And that's where the Hebrews created something ingenious, a fire that heats the whole night without you needing to wake up to feed it. How do you keep a fire lit for 6 months straight without burning down your house or having to get up every hour to feed the flames? The Hebrews solved this problem in a way that engineers today find fascinating. In the center of several ancient houses in Tel Arad, there were shallow circular depressions dug directly into the stone floor. 1 men, 3.3 ft in diameter, 20 centimeters 8 in deep, lined with flat, perfectly fitted stones. Inside, thick layers of compacted ash. At first it looked like just a fire pit, but it was much more sophisticated than that. They were radiation braziers. The technique worked like this. During the day while cooking, they would fill this brazier with hot embers, not high flames embers, incandescent charcoal that burns slowly and radiates constant heat. The lining stones would absorb this heat for hours, and when the embers cooled, the stones continued to radiate heat all night long. You slept warm with no active fire inside the house. And the fuel? Charcoal from olive and oak wood, mainly dense woods that burn slowly, and dried animal dung mixed with straw. It may sound strange, but well-dried dung burns clean with little smoke and generates constant heat for hours, and every family that had sheep or goats had abundant dung. The brazier's position wasn't random, always in the center of the main room. Why? Because heat spreads in all directions. A central brazier heats all the surrounding rooms uniformly. In larger houses, there were smaller secondary braziers in the corners, not to burn more wood, but to place heated stones that came from the main brazier. Some houses in Beersheba even had small stone channels in the floor that directed the hot air from the braziers to more distant rooms. It wasn't improvisation, my dears. It was calculated thermal engineering. But keeping a fire going for 6 months straight requires fuel, a lot of fuel. And before winter arrived, each family needed to have accumulated piles and piles of firewood and dried dung. The planning began in the summer, and whoever didn't prepare didn't make it through the winter. But before talking about the dark side, there's another survival technology that needs to be told. Exodus 22:26-27 says something specific. If you take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, return it to him by sunset, because that is his only covering. It is the cloak for his body. What else will he sleep in? Read it again. What else will he sleep in? The cloak wasn't just clothing, it was survival equipment. If you believe God established laws to protect the most vulnerable, comment, God is the protector of the poor. Textile. Fragments preserved in the Dead Sea caves show that cloaks were made of sheep's wool, specifically from sheep adapted to the mountain climate. Thick, oily wool that retained heat even when wet. And the Hebrews didn't wear 1 layer of clothing. They wore 3. First layer, a light linen tunic next to the skin. Linen absorbs sweat and dries fast, fundamental because moisture robs body heat faster than dry cold. Second layer, a thick wool tunic, the everyday clothing, dense fabric that creates insulating air pockets. Third layer, the cloak, a huge rectangular piece 2 by 1.5 m, 6.5 x 5 ft. Heavy wool, sometimes mixed with goat hair to better resist wind and rain. This cloak had multiple functions. During the day, protection against wind and rain. At night, a blanket. On trips, an improvised tent. For a poor person, it was literally all he had. That's why the law was clear. You can take the cloak as a loan guarantee during the day, but before the sun sets, you give it back, because without it, the person doesn't survive the night. Curious detail. Cloaks were dyed in dark colors, dark blue, brown, black. Why? Dark colors absorb more solar heat. And the fringes on the edges, which Numbers 15:38 mentions. Besides the religious meaning, they kept the fabric from unraveling. They made the cloak last for more years. Vital when it takes you months to weave one. Clothes solved part of the problem. But there was another critical challenge. How to store food for 6 months without it spoiling. How do you store wheat for 6 months without it rotting or being devoured by rats? The Hebrews discovered a secret that the food industry only formalized in the 20th century. In Megiddo, when you excavate, you find vertical tunnels dug into the rock, going down 8 mm, 26 ft. At the bottom, circular chambers, 3 mm, 10 ft, in diameter, hundreds of them, all over the city, underground grain silos. The design was specific, a narrow mouth at the top, a wide base at the bottom. Bottle-shaped. First, the depth. Down there at 8 mm, the temperature stays constant all year round, about 18 degrees Celsius, 64 degrees Celsius. Not hot enough for the grain to germinate, not cold enough to crack the seed. Second, the walls were lined with waterproof plaster. It blocked moisture from the soil, damp grain rots in days. Third, and here it gets interesting, when you fill a sealed silo with grain to the top and seal the opening, the oxygen inside is consumed by the natural respiration of the grains themselves. A low oxygen atmosphere is created. Insects die without oxygen. Fungi don't grow without oxygen. It's the same principle of controlled atmosphere that the modern industry uses in giant warehouses today. But silos weren't the only technique. Ancient cisterns, those that had cracked and were no longer useful for water, were converted into cold storage chambers. Why did cisterns work well? Limestone rock has insulating properties, and the surrounding stone, which was in contact with water for years, maintains residual moisture that preserves vegetables. Carrots, onions, garlic. Root vegetables lasted for months in these naturally cool and damp chambers. All of this required planning. The summer harvest had to be processed and stored correctly. Fuel for 6 months of winter had to be collected and dried before the rains. Clothes had to be repaired or new ones woven. But there was one technology that combined two problems into one system: how to cook and heat the house with the same fire. In practically every Israelite house you excavate, you find the same thing: a beehive-shaped clay oven, 80 cm 2.6 ft high, with clay walls 10 to 15 cm, 4 to 6 in thick. Early in the morning, they would light the oven. While it heated, they prepared the dough. When it reached maximum temperature, they would bake several loaves of bread at once, not just for the day, but for several days. After the bread came out, the oven stayed hot for 6 to 8 hours. This residual heat warmed the house all day. In the afternoon, many families would cook stews or vegetables using the oven's decreasing heat. Slow cooking without spending extra fuel. And there was an important social detail. Some houses had larger ovens, not because the family was larger, but because they functioned as communal ovens. Poor families who couldn't maintain their own oven used their neighbor's oven. In return, they would help collect fuel or share other resources. And this community spirit went beyond the oven. During the coldest months, there were social practices that probably saved more lives than any single technology. John 10:22 records something curious. Then came the festival of dedication at Jerusalem. It was winter, and Jesus was in the temple courts walking in Solomon's colonnade. The festival of dedication, Hanukkah, happens in December. The middle of winter in the mountains. Why risk traveling in the cold for a festival? Because community was a survival strategy. Synagogues from the Second Temple period had fixed braziers built into the floor, not decorative, functional. During the cold months, families would gather in these heated communal spaces, share literal warmth, and share resources. Rabbinical records preserved in the Talmud describe social practices from the period. Families that had excess firewood would distribute it to their neighbors. Whoever had extra grain gave it to those whose stock was low. It wasn't optional charity. It was an organized system of mutual survival. Houses in Capernaum were built in clusters, groups of 4 to 6 residences, sharing a central courtyard. During winter storms, these families would gather in the largest house of the group. The body heat of 20 to 30 people in an enclosed space raises the temperature several degrees. Collective human heating. And there was another aspect: shared work. Agriculture stopped in the cold months. So men dedicated themselves to indoor work, weaving baskets, repairing tools, making pottery. But they did it collectively. Communal workshops, where several artisans worked together, sharing the heated space and the tools. Women also gathered to spin wool and weave. Manual labor generates body heat. Doing it in a group optimizes the heating of the environment. This interdependence wasn't weakness, my dears. It was social engineering applied to survival. But not everyone managed to prepare adequately. And when winter caught a family unprepared, the consequences were brutal. What happened when someone didn't prepare for winter? The Bible doesn't hide it, and it's disturbing. 2 Kings 6:25 describes the siege of Samaria. There was a great famine in Samaria. A donkey's head sold for 80 shekels of silver. A donkey's head. The least nutritious part of the animal, the least desirable, sold for the equivalent of 3 months' salary. The siege happened during the winter, when stores were already naturally low. And the cold made the famine even more deadly. Famine plus cold is a lethal combination. Your body burns calories trying to stay warm. Without food, you freeze faster. Jeremiah 14:2 describes another winter crisis. The land mourns. The nobles send their servants for water. They come to the cisterns but find no water. Without rain in the autumn, the cisterns didn't fill. Without stored water, the winter became unsustainable. Ancient cemeteries show something grim. Peaks in infant mortality during January and February. Children were the first victims when the food ran out. Proverbs 6:6-8 isn't just moral wisdom, it's a survival manual. Go to the ant, you sluggard. It stores its provisions in summer and gathers its food at harvest. The ant stores in the summer because it knows that winter kills those who don't prepare. In Tel Dan, skeletons of entire families were found inside their homes, apparently dead from cold and starvation during a particularly severe winter in the 6th century BC. The hard truth is that technology alone saved no one. You could have the best house, the best oven, the best clothes, but if you didn't plan months in advance, if you didn't store enough, if you didn't have a community to support you in critical moments, you didn't make it through the winter. The Hebrews who survived were those who understood a fundamental lesson. In the mountains, in the cold, without modern technology, there is no individual survival. Only collective survival based on planning, preparation, and cooperation. And when we look at Jerusalem a few centuries later, in the time of Jesus, we see these same lessons applied in a much larger and more complex city. Now click the video on the screen to watch how Solomon's temple was built and what the workers' lives were like. Click now to discover the secrets of that construction.